Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Thursday, March 23rd, 2017. A quick alert for you. Tomorrow's Facebook Live feed, the video feed of my podcast recording session, will be an hour earlier due to some scheduling issues I have. So that's 1 o'clock Pacific time, 4 o'clock Eastern, and, well, you got to calculate it if you're someplace else. Lots of news to cover today and much to comment on. The developing story that I waited a little while before recording today is that the Republicans figured out they didn't have the votes in the House to pass the Obamacare repeal and replacement package, and so they've put the vote off to twist some arms, dangle some inducements, and of course the inducements that they're offering is to make the package even meaner and more cruel than it already is. We'll be watching. They say they're going to try for another vote, or try again for a vote tomorrow, and we'll see how that goes. The big story in Washington, really, though, is the torrents of leaks, the spin, the intelligence information that is being spewed about, with, of course, no evidence behind it. And Devin Nunes, who is the California Republican who pretends to chair the House Intelligence Committee, where they're supposed to be running this investigation, he calls it an investigation into leaking, and his Democratic colleagues call it an investigation into Russian interference in the 2016 election cycle. But Devin Nunes really stepped on it yesterday, and I did report part of it. I reported his first briefing with the media before he went to the White House to share what he calls new intelligence. He won't define it or the source, but he says it shows that the monitoring of Trump officials, which he says occurred after the election, not before, may have incidentally been picked up by monitoring and wiretaps interceptions of the communications of non-Americans, and that this would have been legal. Troubling, he finds it troubling that the results were shared, he says, by the Obama administration in irresponsible ways. But all of this, of course, is just hot air. We can believe or not believe Devin Nunes. But he clearly sees himself more as an advocate for the Trump White House than he does as an arbiter for the American people, and he's been called out on that by his Democratic colleagues. Adam Schiff, a former prosecutor from Southern California, who is the ranking Democrat on the House Intel Committee, said Nunes has to decide whether he's chairman of an independent investigation or is going to act as a surrogate of the White House because he cannot do both. Now, I credit Schiff under these circumstances for being a pretty savvy and tough counterpart to the Republican chairman. But then he went and felt compelled to up the ante and make an unproven leak of his own. And what Adam Schiff said was that he's, as I said, former prosecutor. He speaks very carefully. And earlier this week, he gave Rachel Maddow an interview where he said that he had seen circumstantial evidence in the intelligence cache that we're not allowed to see of collusion between Trump officials and Russian counterparts. And what Schiff did was up the ante after Nunes went through his maneuvers on Wednesday, and he told MSNBC that he has more than circumstantial evidence, but that's where he stopped short. Now, consider just how crazy this is. We have members of each political party who are allowed to look at all the secrets of the United States. And they go in and look at those secrets, and then they come out and spin up the leaks that will benefit their narrative. And what this shows is that Congress is not in any way, shape, or form capable of investigating this. And I hear the calls for an independent commission. As you may know, I observed the work of the 9/11 Commission in Washington, and it was a whitewash. It was intentionally set up to do that. And there is talk that a congressman from the Bay Area here, Eric Swalwell, has introduced legislation to set up an independent commission. And what really made me quiver was that he met with Lee Hamilton, who had co-chaired the 9/11 Commission with former New Jersey Governor Kaine. And he got advice from Lee Hamilton on how to get this commission enacted by calling it a National Commission on Foreign Interference in the 2016 election, dropping the word Russia from it. Well, all I can tell you is that Lee Hamilton, the former congressman from Indiana, is the most reliable source of whitewash in Washington. And if he comes within, 50 yards of any commission investigating this, I will have no confidence. So Nunes gave an apology, mostly to the Democratic members of the House Intelligence Committee today. And one of them is a friend of this program, Jackie Spear, Democrat from the Bay Area, who sits on the House Intelligence Commission. She described it as a generic apology, saying that it wasn't clear which part of his actions he was apologizing for. He just made this bland statement that sometimes you make good judgment calls and sometimes you don't. But this really is a serious issue. And I believe that we do need to go outside. The problem is there's no easy solution here. An independent counsel really strikes me as the most effective way to expose the truth and maybe hold some people accountable. But we don't have a special prosecutor statute anymore, and the Justice Department is poisoned despite Jeff Sessions' recusal. His number 2 has not been confirmed by the Senate, and it's not clear that he would exercise the kind of independence that we need. And so we may go to our graves with this story unresolved, but it's clear that Devin Nunes is out of his depth and does not qualify to be chair of the Intelligence Committee. And we also are relying once again on the credibility of Jim Comey, the FBI director, who put a lot of this in motion by admitting in his testimony on Monday that there is an FBI investigation. He dodged virtually every other question. But we just have a bunch of people who have no credibility, whose self-interest and political motivations are quite clear. And so this is a pissing contest where everybody comes away smelling really bad. And the dry cleaning bills stack up. So as we're looking at this, it's really hard to predict what shoe will drop next, what leak will drip next. But we have from CNN more official leaks coming from unnamed sources without a shred of evidence. But here it is. The FBI, according to CNN, has information suggesting that Trump's associates had contacts with suspected Russian agents, and here comes the weasel word, possibly to arrange the leak of hacked information harmful to Hillary Clinton's campaign. Possibly. Possibly not. Now, this is spin. As I pointed out yesterday when I called a new truth emergency here in America. I played you the clips from the PBS NewsHour and from Rachel Maddow's commentary and coverage the night before. We hear all of these qualified terms, and the detail obscures the lack of proof. Here comes the detail. CNN says the information suggesting collusion included accounts of meetings between individuals as well as phone, travel, and business records. But we don't see any of these. So these details are kind of truthy substitutes for evidence, but anybody could speculate like this, right? If you're investigating people, you're going to look at their phone records, their travel records, where they went, who they met, and so this is just so bizarre. And as you may know, I've been covering news and politics since Nixon. The real crook, Tricky Dick, was in the White House, and Roger Stone, one of Trump's slippery advisors, was on the campaign team of Richard Nixon. And this makes Nixon look like a saint. So the rest of the CNN report includes that, we have Comey acknowledging that the investigation began in July of last year, and The CNN question here, it says, this raises questions as to why the investigation into Trump's campaign was kept secret ahead of the election while the FBI went public just days before the vote with the news that it found more emails in its probe into Clinton's communications. Now, this is another substantive question, and it goes directly to the credibility of too tall Jim Comey. Why is it, now that we look back, that he kept a lid on the investigation into Trump, and he three times went public with out-of-the-box commentary on the Clinton investigation? First in July when he said, no, not going to prosecute. She was careless. She broke the law, but we're not going to do anything. And then the twin comments in late October and early November. So why that guy still has his job and the confidence of so many people must be based on the leverage he has on those very people. So the Donald gave an exclusive interview to Time magazine where he tried to explain away many of the claims that have been proven false or fundamentally untrue. And he went through some of the same stuff that he's been talking about recently. The fact that he claims he predicted a little riot that occurred in Sweden. But, of course, he has to gild the lily by saying that it was a massive riot and that death resulted. Well, he didn't actually predict it. He said it had already happened, and 2 days later, minor riots broke out in an immigrant neighborhood of Stockholm, but nobody died. That's just one example, all right? NATO, Brexit, wiretapping, all of this stuff. And so the Washington Post and Glenn Kessler, their fact checker, they go through all this stuff and conclude that he's just full of shit. And they gave him 4 new Pinocchios. We should line those babies up on some mantle at the White House, right? All the Pinocchios that Trump has earned. There's a great story that you might not find because it's at Foreign Policy Magazine, and you may encounter a paywall if you go there to read it. I was able to get a copy of it, and then the paywall came slamming down on me. There's a link to it in the show file for today's podcast at peterbcollins.com. And the author of the piece is a friend of this program and the acknowledged expert on America's spy community, James Bamford. And he writes about an agency that is pretty secret. It's one of the 17 that is on the chart underneath the Director of National Intelligence. And Bamford opens by telling a story about how President Obama, in his first year in office, just 5 months into his presidency, was hanging out at a burger stand in Washington and making small talk with a guy. And said, "What do you do?" And he said, "Well, I work at NGA." And Obama said, "Yeah, what's that?" And he said, "National Geospatial Intelligence Agency." Obama said, "Well, explain to me exactly what this National Geospatial blah, blah, blah." He couldn't even finish the name. He'd been president for 5 months. He didn't know it existed. Well, Bamford writes, 8 years after that videotape aired, the NGA remains by far the most shadowy of the big 5 spy agencies. And they're the guys with the cameras. And they have drones that they can fly. For example, if they put 2 of them over Manhattan, they can capture the movement of everybody under their scope. So also, it's not well known, but the NGA has a big building that cost $1.4 billion in Washington, D.C. It's also purchased 99 acres in St. Louis to construct additional buildings worth almost $2 billion. And he writes, the NGA is to pictures what the NSA is to voices. Its principal function is to analyze the billions of images and miles of video captured by drones in the Middle East and spy satellites circling the globe. And the NGA is not allowed to operate in the United States, but the Pentagon admits that between 2006 and 2015, NGA drones flew over the United States on at least 20 missions. Now, they tell us, don't be alarmed. It was natural disasters, search and rescue, National Guard training. Yeah. But I recommend you read this piece because it's fascinating to see what their capabilities are. And if you don't recall, look up an interview I did in the past couple of years with Yasha Levine. Just go to peterbcollins.com and put Yasha in the search window and look for the piece about the NGA, because Levine was one of the first to expose it to me, and he also exposed the cozy relationship between Google and the NGA, and that Google Earth was funded by the NGA, and this came to light when they added a new contract to the deal, and they said it had to be sole source. And Microsoft was pissed because they wanted to get in on the spy action, and Google had successfully gotten an exclusive and elbowed them out of the way. It's fascinating to see how the spooks work. As I mentioned, the vote on repealing and replacing Obamacare has been put off for today, and they're going to try to find ways to persuade the hardliners who think that it doesn't go far enough because it does not eviscerate a fundamental set of benefits that everyone, they're called essential health benefits, that include maternity care, preventive services, wellness checkups, and rehabilitation. And these essential health benefits are, they think, socialism. And the conservatives say that unless that's gone, Obamacare repeal isn't real. Now, that puts Ryan and Trump in a very tough position, because each move they make to appease these haters, these ugly people who just want to see poor people die in this country, every move they make in that direction, they lose the it's so hard to describe this. There are people who claim to be moderate Republicans in the House today. You and I would not consider them so moderate, but that's the tag they wear. And so it's a real mess. And this is actually good news for those of us who think that Obamacare is better than the American Health Care Act. And it appears to me that if they can't get this through the House in the next week or two, they may miss the window to try to actually repeal Obamacare this year, because the insurance industry is going to tell them, look, this boat has to sail by the middle of April. We either extend Obamacare at least another year, or you've got to repeal it and tell us what direction you're going. So time is on the side of us, and we'll see just how it all plays out. Every day I take a moment to thank the people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast with your subscriptions. People like Judy Holloway, Linda Gray, Craig Baylog, Steve Wazensky, and let's add another one, Benny Alto and his pooches up in Oregon. I'm grateful for your support, and I invite new people to join the party here. Come on over to peterbcollins.com. You click on the menu button, pull it down, click on Become a Subscriber. That takes you to the sign-up page, and in minutes, you can be a subscriber with or without PayPal. If you're allergic to PayPal, we understand, and you can mail a check or a money order or folding money to the P.O. box that's listed there on the page. And I probably won't get to refresh it until next week, but we have added a bonus book to the list. It's the paperback edition of Thomas Frank's Listen Liberal. So the other big action, of course, on Capitol Hill relates to the confirmation proceedings for Neil Gorsuch as a Supreme Court justice. And I am very delighted to report that the Democrats, led by Chuck Schumer of New York, appear to be leading toward a filibuster. Now, we don't have full-throated confirmation of this. They'll probably wait for the hearings to conclude. But Schumer has said that he will have to earn 60 votes for confirmation, and my vote will be no. So this sets up another struggle. The Republicans have the majority, and they could change the Senate rules to eliminate filibuster possibility for a Supreme Court nomination. It would be permanent unless, of course, the rule would be reinstated down the road. And it's a risky maneuver for the Democrats, because if everything in the Senate only requires a majority, well, the Republicans have that, and the Democrats can just sit there and twiddle their thumbs and make fundraising phone calls. But if they succeed in facing down this threat, and they can block the confirmation of Gorsuch, now we don't know if the next guy or gal would be worse, But this would be a very strong statement of Democratic resistance. So I'm encouraged by this. And, of course, we have to see the Democratic caucus hold and unify. And the big outlier is Joe Manchin of West Virginia, who really is a Republican. He just pretends to be a Democrat. And speaking of Gorsuch, I want to applaud Liliana Segura, a talented writer who focuses on prison issues at The Intercept. And she pointed out something that I was unaware of. On the night that Donald Trump announced the nomination of Neil Gorsuch for the Supreme Court, at almost the very time that it was occurring, a man in Missouri was lying on a gurney with lethal injection drugs entering his veins. 37-year-old Mark Christensen was declared dead minutes later, in the same hour that Gorsuch was named. And Gorsuch has fingerprints over capital punishment cases, including the one of Christensen. And Gorsuch has, as a member of the appeals court based in Denver, signed off on the death penalties of many problematic executions in recent years. And no one, despite the heavy questioning coming from Democrats of Gorsuch, no one has asked him to define himself on the death penalty. There's one tangential question that was raised about the Supreme Court ruling in the case of Glossop versus Gross, which led the justices in a 5-4 decision say that the execution protocol was sloppy, but they upheld it anyway. And the Glossop case basically says, we don't care how you kill these capital convicts. Just kill them. And if it's cruel, if it's unusual, if it's painful, if they're on there for 40 minutes struggling with the drugs, it's not my problem. After all, these are bad guys, and we don't care how they die. And these, libtards who have feelings for the insensitive people who killed somebody or committed some other extreme crime just need to shut up. So, for example, on January 12th, 2015, a 3-judge panel of the 10th Circuit Court, including Gorsuch, affirmed a decision to execute a man named Charles Warner. And Warner had raised the issues of the fact that these drug cocktails that they've been using amount to a program of biological experimentation on captive and unwilling human subjects. But Judge Gorsuch doesn't have a problem with that. And when a case came up on appeal in 2016, Gorsuch joined the panel of judges who rejected the lawsuit dismissing the boxed execution in Oklahoma as an innocent misadventure. I don't usually find much good to say about Terry McAuliffe. He was a bagman for the Clintons, and then he ran for governor of Virginia. One of my nieces worked on his campaign. But Terry McAuliffe did something noteworthy yesterday. He issued pardons for the 4 former sailors who became known as the Norfolk Four. Back in 1997, they were accused of the rape and killing of Michelle Moore Bosco. But DNA evidence linked another man to the crimes, and he acknowledged that. He said these guys didn't have anything to do with it. He is serving a life sentence. And 4 men have had their full rights restored. Of course, their reputations will never recover. Interesting piece in my San Francisco Chronicle today, and I'm going to criticize them a little bit later at the end of the podcast. But Bob Agelko, who is a bright guy, he's got a law degree, and he writes about legal affairs. He notes that it's been a week now since the second royal decree about travel bans was issued by number 45. And it was almost immediately put on hold by a court in Hawaii, and then parts of it were also stayed by a court in Maryland. Despite the fact that Trump says we have this, emergency situation where bad guys are trying to fly into the United States and cause mayhem, and we got to stop this immediately, there's been no appeal. The Justice Department hasn't even announced that they intend to appeal or when they plan to file. And we were told that, Trump had to have this to keep America safe. So it's puzzling. And it may be linked to the Gorsuch confirmation hearings, because the effect of this slow boat to appeal is that Gorsuch may in fact be confirmed by the time an appeal on this gets to the Supreme Court, and we can certainly assume that Gorsuch will vote in favor of the man who gave him the gig. Details emerging about the Parliament incident in London yesterday. Turns out it was a solo guy, 52-year-old Khalid Massoud, and he was not sent to London by the Islamic State. Now, the Islamic State is taking credit for it, but the British authorities freely admit that while he has a criminal history, Massoud has no history of contact with jihadists or other Islamic extremists, and there is no indication that he was radicalized or that he was put up to this by other people. There's no prior evidence of his intent or of the plot, and he was born in Kent, England, in 1964 on Christmas Day. He's always been a British citizen. So the idea that hordes of jihadists are trying to ride planes into the United States or into Britain to settle scores, it's a myth. And it's promoted by the people who want to create authoritarian regimes and police states. A copycat in Antwerp, Belgium today drove his car into a couple of pedestrian pathways, but he was intercepted by police and no one was hurt. In Israel today, we've learned about the arrest of an Israeli teenager who holds American citizenship. And he is being accused of making some of the threatening phone calls to Jewish centers, synagogues, community centers, and other Jewish establishments, including the Anti-Defamation League here in the United States. So we now have two suspects, none of whom fit the profile of Trump-loving anti-Semites, who appear to be responsible for some of these phone calls. There have been more than 100 of them since the first of the year. And it's convenient to have the guy in St. Louis who was trying to get even with a girlfriend and I guess didn't have any revenge porn to post. And now we have this teenager whose name is being withheld because he is underage, and we don't know how many calls he was actually responsible for. I want to recommend a great piece by Andrew Bacevich, retired Army colonel, retired professor of history at Boston University, and a guy I deeply admire because he's one of the few military men who is willing to call out the lunacy of the people in top brass uniforms today. And he begins his piece by citing the famous big band leader Artie Shaw, who was married and divorced 8 times, and described himself as an incurable optimist. And he applies that label to General Joseph Votel, the new head of the U.S. Central Command. And he quotes some of the bizarre language that is quite divorced from reality that was offered up in a 64-page statement issued to Congress recently by General Votel. And this is a fascinating piece. I won't take time to quote a whole lot of it. But, for example, the history that is quoted of CENTCOM's achievements is just so bizarre. Here's a description of the invasion of Iraq that you won't recognize, all right? In the wake of 9/11, the international community found Saddam Hussein's continued lack of cooperation with the UN Security Council regarding weapons of mass destruction unacceptable. Hussein's continued recalcitrance led the United Nations Security Council to authorize the use of force by a U.S.-led coalition. Operation Iraqi Freedom began on 19 March 2003, and it is claimed as a victory. Bacevich applies some truth here. In fact, the Security Council didn't authorize the invasion. Bush's attempts to get that authorization failed abysmally. And what the international community really found unacceptable was Bush's insistence that he was going to have his war regardless of what others might think. So Bacevich is this rare individual who knows enough and sometimes too much to take on the bullshit that is spewing out of the Pentagon these days. And he concludes that as long as they are captive to this kind of fantasy, he says what they're doing is waging an endless war of attrition. And what exactly does General Votel propose? Persist, he says. In concrete terms, that means keep on killing and enabling our allies to do the same until the other side is finally exhausted and gives up. But he quotes a little old soldier. His name is, what is his name here? Bolton. He says, 15 years after launching a worldwide effort to defeat and destroy terrorist organizations, the U.S. finds itself locked in a pathologically recursive loop. We fight to prevent attacks and defend our values, only to incite further violence against ourselves and allies while destabilizing already chaotic regions. The Palestinians who live in East Jerusalem have been applying for Israeli citizenship. It's their right, even if it's second-class citizenship. Still, the Israeli bureaucracy is dragging its feet in granting those applications. There are 330,000 Palestinians, 37% of the population in East Jerusalem, and only about 15,000 so far have requested an Israeli passport or citizenship paper. And finally today, my San Francisco Chronicle pulled off an act of demagoguery today. They published what appear to be contrasting op-eds regarding Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s views on vaccination and his conversation with Donald Trump, which has not led anywhere so far, about leading a panel to investigate the safety of vaccines. And I've talked about this before. I believe in vaccination. Bobby Kennedy Jr. believes in vaccination. In his book, he writes how he required all 6 of his kids to get all the vaccinations. But Bobby Kennedy doesn't believe that if you think that immunization is a good idea, that you automatically just yield to the demagogues who say that you cannot think critically about vaccinations. So I've linked to both of these pieces, and I invite you to read them. They both slam Bobby Kennedy as a critic of vaccinations, when in fact he is a critic of the side effects of vaccinations and wants to air these things out. And I was distressed that one of my Facebook friends, Wendy Bloom, who is a registered nurse and a good political activist, signed the more critical piece, which describes Robert F. Kennedy Jr. as a vaccine doubter, and that this must be swept away. I just believe that we are entitled to think for ourselves. The policies about immunization, I think, are sensible. But we also must be honest that there are side effects, that the mercury and thimerosal create potential dangers, and that we shouldn't just stick our heads in the sand next to all those used syringes. Thanks for joining me today on the Peter B. Collins Podcast. I'll be live on Facebook Friday, 1 o'clock Pacific, 4 p.m. Eastern.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails.